I did not want a The Last of Us television show at all. My attitude towards The Last of Us as a franchise has always been leave it alone, right? So they have this incredible smash hit game that they released in 2013, and it's fantastic. You know, I play it when it comes out. I'm only 14 years old, but this game blew my mind. I remember after I finished it, like in the days and weeks after I finished it, it's all I could think about because the ending had, for me, the perfect amount of ambiguity. You know, did Ellie trust what Joel said when he says, you know, I swear I'm not lying? I just love that about it, and it lingered on my mind for ages. Later on down the line, Naughty Dog announces, okay, we're going to make this DLC for the game, but it's a prequel. It's going to detail the events before The Last of Us, as well as go into a little bit of what Ellie was up to while Joel was, you know, impaled and kind of recovering from his injury, right? So I was like, okay, that's fine. At least they're not trying to go past what we know. They're just trying to fill in certain gaps, which is cool. But then you have talk of like a sequel, and honestly, I was very much against them making a sequel for The Last of Us initially because I felt that the story was enough. Of course, you'd be curious about what happened after, but I didn't feel it was necessary. I felt like leaving it at that point and leaving it to the viewer to imagine what happened next was perfectly reasonable. Of course, as The Last of Us Part 2 draws closer to being released, I become super hyped. The game comes out, I play it, and I think Naughty Dog freaking killed it. I think they made a game that is absolutely essential playing for anyone even remotely interested in The Last of Us, because I feel like you don't actually know the story of The Last of Us until you have played both parts 1 and parts 2 because of how interlinked they are. You know, you realize that The Last of Us Part 1 really only tells half of the story, and it's through Part 2 that you've come to understand the true nature of the events in the first game. So I commend Naughty Dog for what they did. I know a lot of people freaking hated The Last of Us Part 2. Some reasons I can understand, other reasons I'm not so on board with, but in the very least, I feel like Naughty Dog did a good job with that game and truly expanded in a way that complemented the first game, right? But you know, last year you hear rumblings about freaking they're working on a remake for The Last of Us Part 1, even though it already had a remaster. And then you hear, oh, they're gonna make a freaking television show. And at this point, you can't help but feel like, oh crap, they are milking this franchise. And I understand, it's probably a very lucrative franchise for them. They're probably making a lot of money. It makes sense that they would want to cash in on this franchise as much as possible before, you know, people, I guess, forget about it. I don't think people would forget about it. But while it's hot, you want to cash in, right? So I get that. But I really didn't want them to make a TV show for this game because I feel like the game tells the story as perfectly as the story can be told. What is a television show really going to add other than introducing people who don't play games to the universe of The Last of Us? And I guess ultimately, that was the goal, right? And so for me, I'm thinking, okay, if you're going to do this, if you're going to make the show, at least please do the game justice. And when you hear that, you know, Neil Druckmann, the creative director of The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2, is actually directly involved in the creation of the show, directly involved in the script. I think he even directly directed, okay, I hate that I said it, but he directed an episode. It's like, okay, things are looking promising. It might be good. And you know what? I gotta give it to them. They did a really freaking good job with the show. You know, unfortunately, it's more the exception than the rule when it comes to video game adaptations in movies and television. But I will confidently say The Last of Us HBO show is actually a good show on its own, independent of how you feel about the game. It's a good show, and I've got to commend it for that. Now, that being said, it's not better than the game, and I never expected it to be. But yeah, I definitely wouldn't go as far as to say that it tells the story better than the game does. I don't think anything could tell the story better than the game told the story. But it's even impressive that the show comes even remotely close to it, which it does. It does. The show actually succeeds in a lot of ways. So the first thing I'll talk about is the performance by the cast. They did a good job, actually, with like portraying these characters. You have Pedro Pascal as Joel, which, you know, initially when he was cast, I didn't really see it, to be honest. I knew he could play the role of Joel. It wasn't like it was impossible, but I wouldn't look at him and be like, oh yeah, that's Joel from The Last of Us. You know what I mean? It didn't quite fit to me. But while it had, in my opinion, a rocky start, I feel like as the show developed, I got to a point where I was able to see him as Joel a lot more comfortably. And while I think his depiction of Joel is different to the game's depiction of Joel, I accepted him as that character, and that was really good. Bella Ramsey as Ellie. Now, when we were first introduced to her as Ellie, with the scene of her having to count to 10 to prove that she's not like turning into an infected, I thought that scene was actually really good. Like, as soon as I saw that scene and she counts to 10 and then ends it with F you, I'm like, that is Ellie. That is 100% Ellie. Perfect. But then after that scene, we start getting some scenes where I can't name one in particular. Maybe the scene at the start of episode 2. But where I'm starting to see some gaps and I'm starting to see some things where I'm like, I don't think the acting is so strong here. And it's not really feeling as much like Ellie, you know? I think especially whenever this show had moments where lines were taken directly, line for line from the game, I would actually kind of cringe watching that, because I'd be like, oof, I know how that is supposed to sound based on having played through this game so many times, having watched so many playthroughs of the game. I just have it committed to memory, exactly all the inflections, the tones, how a line is supposed to be delivered. And so when it's delivered slightly differently, it just feels off to me. And I know that's not the fault of the show. You're not, as an actor, I feel like it'd be quite unhealthy to like freaking obsess over every little inflection you have to give in a performance just to mimic what you've seen somewhere else. But it was quite jarring whenever a line was delivered and it wasn't like how I remembered, you know? It was almost uncanny valley. I was like, that's not quite right. That's not quite right. Luckily, I can say that subsided as the show went over, because like I said, with Joel, I started to recognize Bella Ramsey's Ellie and all the other characters we see kind of constantly appear throughout the show, like Tommy, which is played by Gabriel Luna. And well, Marlene is played by the actress for Marlene in the game, so that was never really a problem. But as time went on in the show, I started identifying the characters as less of, oh, this is this character from the game, and more as their own character, which I think was really good. And it's probably something I had to do, having played the game and been so familiar with it prior to watching the show. Whereas a lot of people watching the show haven't played the game, and so probably didn't have to overcome that initially. I do wonder what an experience would be like for a person who had watched the show and then played the game. Would the game feel weird to them? Maybe, but I'm not too sure. Another thing I've got to mention, the prosthetics or the CGI or whatever they did to make the infected look the way they did. I'm talking the runners, the freaking stalkers, the clickers, and the bloater. They all looked great. They looked exactly like in the game. And I'm very impressed. You know, I'm glad they didn't skimp out on that. I know this show had an expensive budget. And I'm glad that some of that budget seems to have gone into making things look the way they should look. You know, sometimes the environments didn't always look very real. Sometimes it felt like I was watching people in front of a green screen or on a soundstage or whatever they do these days. But when it came to those clickers and when it came to those infected, they looked really good. So I want to say shout out to them for that. I wish the bloater freaking threw like the freaking like body bombs that he does. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. But we do get to see the bloater like rip somebody apart, so that's cool. Now, the story for the show stayed almost 100% faithful to the game, which I was very happy about, because I wouldn't have wanted them to switch things up so drastically that it's almost unrecognizable, because I think the story for The Last of Us, while maybe not being the most groundbreaking story narratively, if you take into account all mediums, was definitely groundbreaking for like video games, and is a story that I hold near and dear to my heart. So I'm glad they were able to keep it pretty much exactly the same, while still introducing new aspects to the story we haven't seen before. So we get that scene at the beginning of the very first episode where they show the scientists and researchers discussing the possibility of a fungus mutating from ants into human hosts and the devastation that would cause. We get the scene in episode 2 where it's showing Jakarta near the start of the outbreak, and you have this science lady talking to the army general about what they should do, and she just says, bomb. That actually makes me laugh so much. It was so melodramatic. It's like, yo, what do you advise we do, miss? Bomb. I'm like, bro, you need to relax. I mean, she was right, ultimately, but you know what I mean? It's a bit crazy to advise that. There are also some things like, they show the uprising against Fedra. You know, we have the episodes with Henry and Sam where the people they're fighting against aren't Fedra, and they're not hunters. The hunters don't actually really appear in this series as opposed to the game, because I guess the hunters in the game are more of like a mindless or at least faceless NPC enemy, whereas they wanted to humanize every enemy in the show, which makes complete sense. But yeah, like when we're doing the Henry and Sam episodes, we're fighting against these like Fedra rebels who had rose up against Fedra and overthrown them. And we kind of get to see that whole dynamic of people that were not the Fireflies, but also weren't happy with the regime they were being, you know, kind of oppressed under as Fedra. And so, you know, it was just interesting to see something that we hadn't seen in the games before. Although, I guess I'm not counting The Last of Us Part 2 because we're not covering that, and I'm not gonna like spoil anything about The Last of Us Part 2 in case someone isn't aware of that story. While we're speaking about Henry and Sam though, I absolutely love how their story was handled. I think it was done really well. It stayed super true to the game. Only thing is, they made Sam quite a few years younger. In the game, Sam was only like 1 year younger than Ellie, whereas in the show, they made him like 8 years old. So he was much younger than Ellie, which I think probably changed the dynamic between them a bit more, because in the games, they were kind of like becoming like close friends. Whereas with Ellie, because he's so much younger than her in the show, I feel like she kind of was more like a older sister figure to him than a friend figure to him. But it still worked out really well. I think it was a nice touch to make Sam deaf and have to use that kind of Etch-a-Sketch to communicate with people who didn't know sign language. And, you know, I thought it was so sweet, the scene where Sam reveals he was bitten, and then Ellie tries to like cure him with her blood. I was like, damn, you know, because that really showcased that Ellie herself is just a young kid, right? And she doesn't know. And hey, I guess no one knew whether it would work or not. In the games, it's kind of made clear that that wouldn't work. But at least in the show, you know, we don't know if that wouldn't work. And so the fact that she tried it and tried to reassure Sam, I thought it was a really sweet scene. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. Sam does try to kill her, which I must say, her deciding to sleep in the same room as Sam, knowing he was infected, whether or not you have miracle blood, it doesn't matter. That's kind of risky. I can't believe she did that. But unfortunately, you know, we get the scene where Henry has to shoot Sam before he shoots himself. Absolutely devastating. But what was most devastating about that episode to me was when Ellie wrote, "I'm sorry," on the Etch-a-Sketch and put it on Sam's grave. I was like, damn. Absolutely heartbreaking. And we get a lot of heartbreaking moments in the show. I would say this one isn't as heartbreaking, but it's probably one of the only instances in the show where we get a massive deviation from the game, and that is Bill's Town, okay? I think how they handled Bill's Town in this show was absolutely fantastic. I was so happy with how they handled it, you know? So in the game, Bill is a recluse. He's in this town that he's got booby-trapped. And as far as we know, nobody knows this guy. Like, nobody hangs out with this guy. He's completely alone. In the show, it starts off like that. We get this really cool montage of how Bill built up his town, how he managed to evade being seen, and, you know, how he's managed to make it self-sustaining. And then he comes across this guy, Frank, who is in the game, but in the game, we only know Frank as Bill's former partner who had killed himself and died hating Bill's guts because of the letter that he left behind. Whereas in the game, we actually get to see Bill and Frank's relationship. Bill and Frank's? Oh yeah, no, that doesn't make sense. Bill and Frank's relationship develop. We actually get to see that. And we get to see how they ended up coming across Joel and Tess. Have I talked about Tess yet? We're going to get to Tess in a moment. But we get to see how they actually interact with them. And it kind of fills that gap in the game where we don't really know what the favor that Bill owed Joel was. In the show, we get to see that the favor Bill owed Joel was that when raiders came, I guess this would be the only instance of us seeing hunters in the show, or one of the only instances at least. But when hunters came to Bill's town and Bill got shot, Frank ended up calling Joel for help, and that's the favor. The episode also showcases Bill and Joel, or Bill and Frank, growing old together. Unlike in the game where, Bill is like well and alive, Bill and Frank grow old together, which makes me a bit curious about the timeline. Does that mean Bill was much older in the show than he was in the game? Probably. But yeah, they grow old together. They decide to die together. Or at least Frank decides he wants to die, and Bill decides he's gonna die with him. And it's just a really sweet story. And I'm personally a sucker for romance. I'm sure many of you know this. But this was such a sweet story to have in the middle of all this apocalyptic chaos. And it's a much nicer ending for Bill, despite the fact he died. So it is a bit of a bittersweet ending. I think it's a nicer ending for him than what he gets in the game, because he doesn't really get an ending. We just see his reaction to seeing his partner hanging. And then we leave him as a kind of miserable, bitter guy in his own town where his only company infected, so I think it was nice that he was able to get a nicer ending here. And I will say this was one of the only instances where I would say I prefer the show's version of events to the game, or at least the show's portrayal of events, because I think this is the only time where there was a major change to what actually happened. Now, that's not to say I wish this had been the way it happened in the game. I like how it happened in the game. And the only reason this was able to happen in the show is because the show didn't have to worry about gameplay. Like, if this was a video game, it's an action shooter. They can't really show a budding romance between two guys in the video game. Where would the gameplay be? You know what I mean? And so that's why they kind of had to have it be where you're just following Bill and you get that environmental storytelling in the game, compared to the show where we don't have to see everything through the perspective of either Joel or Ellie. We're allowed to see perspectives outside of them. And so they can go into the backstory of someone like Bill and show us what that's like. And that's one of the things I would say a show is able to do compared to a game. And one of the things the show has to its advantage as well. Now, I said I was going to talk about Tess. We only get to see Tess in the first 2 episodes of the show, and a little bit in the Bill episode, which I'm really glad we got to see her in the Bill episode, because I like the portrayal of Tess in the show. I really like it. I do think it suffered from the same issues I mentioned with Joel and Ellie, where I felt that because I was so used to how these characters' lines were supposed to be delivered, when it was delivered by these actors, it just didn't feel the same and it didn't feel right. And sometimes I would cringe and be like, oh, you tried it. Unfortunately, I had that happen so many times. I felt like this show, it was giving me fan remake vibes. It was giving me like the feeling of finding a fan remake on YouTube of a story, of a movie or something. It felt like a high budget class project. You know what I mean? And that's I'm not trying to be harsh. That's just how it felt watching the show initially. But things definitely did improve as time went on. Now, while I liked Tess, I do think it was absolutely disgusting how she went out. So she was trying to light the lighter and blow the place to Kingdom Come. This freaking infected turns and sees her. At first, I thought the infected were all gonna run past her because she had been bitten. And so I thought, oh, maybe they can sense she's bitten, so they're gonna leave her alone while she blows it up. Nah, bro. This infected turns towards her, gets closer to her, and you're thinking, yo, what's gonna happen? Why is he moving so slowly? The tendrils come out of his mouth, and he starts, like, practically making out with her. It's like, bro. Now, I understand that the point was it was supposed to be quite disgusting and disturbing and just overall unsettling. But watching that, I was just like, there's no freaking way Tess, the character I know as Tess, would allow that thing to come even close to her face, let alone exchange tendrils with her. I was like, bro, this is freaking disgusting, man. This is disgusting. And I get that was the point, but I don't know. I was like, Tess, why? Well, they took you out like a punk, unfortunately. And while I'm on the note of Tess, I do want to say a big rest in peace to Annie Wershing, who was actually the original actress for Tess in the games, who passed away at the end of January while this show was airing. You know, she passed away from cancer, unfortunately. I just want to say a rest in peace to her. She gave an absolutely great performance in the game, and she gave life to this character, which, even though it was only in the game for a short period of time, had a massive impact on where the story would go. Now, one thing I actually wasn't expecting, I think I had heard of it, but while I was watching the show, I forgot they were going to do this, was to actually cover the Left Behind DLC story in the show. So this is the part where we get to see Ellie's relationship with Riley and how they ended up getting bitten. And this episode was really good. One of my favorite episodes of the show. I think they did a great job at establishing kind of the relationship between Ellie and Riley and why Riley was such an important person to her, as well as establishing the devastation of what happened to them when they got bitten. You know, that scene where Ellie reveals or she discovers her bite mark and just the visceral screaming, just saying the no, like that was like, I watched that, I was like, damn, that felt so real. Like the desperation, the devastation, just the fear in her voice really came through. And it was seeing that scene where I started to realize, okay, I understand why Bella Ramsey was cast in this role. Like, she was doing a good job as Ellie up until that point, but it was scenes where she really had to showcase those like visceral emotions that it really came out to me. I was like, okay, she's very good at this. Very good. And I also want to give a shout out to Storm Reed, who's the actress for Riley. I recognize her as Rue's sister in Euphoria, as well as a few other things she's been in. And she was absolutely fantastic as Riley as well. I think her performance was so powerful, especially at the scene where they reveal their burn and she talks about what they can do. You know, she talks about the two options. They can take the easy way out or they can lose their minds together, you know, and I thought it was so well done. This was the only other instance during the show where I feel like a scene was better executed in the show than it was in the game. Now, granted, I've only played the DLC once. I've also watched through it once. But I actually feel like the performances in the show just felt so much more visceral to me. And overall, I just loved the episode. I think some people might think it's a bit of a slower episode because there's not as much action. But for me, an important thing about The Last of Us isn't just killing infected. An important part about The Last of Us is seeing how these characters connect with each other. You know, I think that's one of the main themes of the show. And I think this episode did a great job of that. Of course, we have to talk about the David episode. So this was what I knew going into it. This was going to have to be the episode where Bella Ramsey as Ellie was going to have to bring it. Because this is the part of the game where you're playing as Ellie. Ellie is no longer the side character, no longer the escort mission. Ellie is the main character. And this was also going to showcase her capability to carry a second season of the show, because Ellie in The Last of Us Part 2 is the main character, right? I mean, that can be argued, but we're not getting into The Last of Us Part 2 spoilers in this one, you know what I mean? So she'd have to really bring it this episode if she wanted to showcase what she can do. And she did a damn good job. Of course, she couldn't have done it without a great supporting performance from the guy who plays David. I mean, this guy was like, he had that soft kind of warm tone, but you can also tell something's not quite right. Whether that's in the tone or just in the things he's saying, it's just a little bit off. We also get to see Troy Baker as freaking, what's his name? James? The first-hand man or the right-hand man, which, you know, he does a great job. I've never seen Troy Baker in a live-action role, so being able to see him actually play a live-action role in this show was really cool, and he did an absolutely great job as well. I feel like all I'm doing is saying people doing an absolutely great job, but that's true. The acting performances in this show were good. The only issues I ever had were when I felt like I knew how a character was supposed to be more than they were being portrayed in the show, until I kind of accepted that these characters are not exactly the same as the ones I was used to. These are different characters, but the same. If you know what I mean. A bit complicated, but you know what I mean. So while Joel is incapacitated, Ellie is the one that, you know, is looking for food. She's the one that gets captured by David. And she's the one that ultimately has to save herself from David's advances. You know, the whole thing was super creepy, super scary, and Bella Ramsey sold the performance so well. You know, you could feel the fear and anger coming from her in many scenes throughout this episode, and she absolutely killed it. You know, I'm super glad we got the interrogation scene with Joel when he's trying to find Ellie. They did that very well. That is one scene where I'll also say, you know what, I did not cringe doing that bit, because I was like, yo, this feels exactly like it did in the game. And I just love that he delivered the line where the guy says, I'm not going to tell you anything. He's like, all right. And he said, it's okay. I believe him. I'm like, oof, too good, too good. One thing I really liked that they did in the show that was different to the game is that when Ellie is brutalizing David, just mashing him to a pulp, basically, right? In the game, Joel actually kind of grabs her and stops her from doing it, and then takes her out of the building. And I really like that because, you know, we get that scene where he comforts her, you know, he grabs her face, looks in the eyes, the sound goes silent, so you can only hear the music but not the voices, and he's saying something to her. And then he takes her out of the building. I loved that. But I have seen some people interpret it as Joel saving her from the burning building, which I don't quite like, because I think it's very important as a viewer that you see that Ellie saved herself. Because that's what she had to do in that moment. You know, in her eyes, Joel might be dead at that moment. She doesn't know what has happened back where she left him. So she is thinking, it's only me. I have to save me or no one else will. And she does that. But I think some people are able to interpret it as Joel saving her because he takes her out of the building. And I think that's one of the reasons why they didn't have him enter the burning building in the TV show version. Instead, she just stops because she's freaking exhausted, and you can see that kind of glazed over look in her eyes, you know, once she's finished the deed. And then she gets up and she walks out of the building herself before Joel finds her, grabs her, and does all that comforting. And we get to see just an absolutely beautiful scene of embrace between them. But I just think it's so important that the viewer sees that she saved herself. She shouldn't have had to, but she did, you know, and I just think that's very important. And I think they executed that fantastically as well. Again, it's one of those things where I don't wish it were like that in the game, but I'm glad we have both versions. The David episode was my favorite episode of the whole show. I think from beginning to end, in terms of the action, in terms of the performances, in terms of the overall theme of the episode, I think it is the strongest one. I won't say by far, because there are other episodes which are very good as well, but that is my favorite personally. Also, David is an absolute freaking savage for pimp slapping that little girl, right? And then feeding her her own father later on. Bro, this guy is evil. Like, we knew he was evil, but fam, are you okay? And then we have the final episode where we actually get to see Ellie's mom, Anna. This is the first time we're we're getting to see Ellie's mum. Of course, Anna is portrayed by Ashley Johnson, the voice actress for Ellie. And as soon as the episode opened and we hear her running through the forest, she's not even saying words at this point. It's just grunts. My ears just went, that's Ellie. Immediately, I was like, oh my God, that is what Ellie sounds like. Like, it's just such a distinctive voice. I actually had a similar thing when seeing Troy Baker as James, because when he would say certain things, I'm like, wait a minute, that's Joel. That's Joel's voice. Although I think Troy Baker did do a bit more effort into like masking that voice, because obviously, you know, he was not just using his natural voice when voicing Joel, but you could still kind of hear Joel in there. But Ellie's voice is just Ashley's voice. So when she was like in the scene, she just sounded like Ellie, which was really cool. And I liked her scene a lot. We get to actually get an insight into how Ellie perhaps got her immunity. The fact that Anna was bitten while giving birth to Ellie. And so by the time that, you know, Anna cuts the umbilical cord, some cordyceps have already made their way into Ellie's system. And that is potentially, well, probably the reason why she has immunity. I thought that was super interesting. I did not expect the show to go as far as to try to explain where Ellie got her immunity from, but I thought it was a really cool touch. And for me, it kind of makes me curious, like, obviously it'd be unethical, but would they try to repeat the experiment? I mean, obviously we have Marlene, who is dead now, but I'm thinking, would anyone be like, yo, we should get a pregnant woman, right? And then, in fact, you know what? We're not going to go there. The final episode was the shortest one, but it is the episode where we see Ellie get taken in by the Fireflies for treatment, and Joel break her out. And that scene was absolutely brutal. Even before we get to that, we got, you know, a lot of really nice scenes between Ellie and Joel, kind of coming to the end of their journey. Joel mentioning that, you know, kind of Ellie is sort of the reason he found meaning in his life again. He sort of opens up to Ellie about how he tried to kill himself previously. We get the scene with the giraffes, which I'm not gonna lie, personally, I've always thought the giraffe scene was a bit overrated. Like, it's a nice scene, but when I see people put it in their top 10 moments list for The Last of Us, I'm a bit like, I mean, bro, they're just giraffes. I get that it represents Ellie kind of starting to see joy again after her traumatic experience or with David, because up until then she was distant, she was zoning out, she just seemed kind of out of it. And now we get to see her smiling and laughing again. I totally get that. I just think the scene's a little bit overrated, but that's just me though. So we have all those nice moments. Then we get to the Fireflies hospital. Marlene tells Joel, you know, Ellie's being prepped for surgery. We're about to scramble her brains. We're about to take the cordyceps out and we're going to make a cure for the whole of humanity. And Joel is like, nah. Joel is such a savage, man. The thing is, yeah, playing it in the game, because you are playing as Joel, it doesn't feel as bad because the enemies you're shooting, they're just enemies. You've been shooting enemies the whole game. These are just more enemies you have to shoot. Whereas in the show, you're watching Joel do this. You're watching him kill the people trying to save humanity. And you understand why. He sees it as him protecting his daughter. But this guy is mowing people down. You know, in the show, they have it all silent with like the music playing in the back. And you're like, this guy is a monster. You know what I mean? It was so interesting seeing it from that perspective, because it's the first time you see it from a third person perspective. In the game, you are the person doing it. So it just feels like, yeah, you know, like these are the obstacles in my way. But watching it as a viewer on the show, you're like, Joel, relax, man. You are killing everybody. And they are just trying to save humanity. They're not trying to hurt you specifically. It is actually kind of crazy. And I appreciated that the show was able to give me that experience. I got that experience with The Last of Us Part 2 as well. I won't go into it because we're not doing spoilers for Last of Us Part 2 in this video. But anyone who's aware will know how I got a similar experience of being like, I don't want this character to do this right now. You know what I mean? But yeah, no, it was super interesting seeing it in the show. And I thought the finale was pretty good as well. Obviously, I knew exactly what was going to go down. But it was nice seeing how they portrayed it going down. And we get the final scene with Ellie asking Joel straight up, like, tell me everything you said about the Fireflies was true. And Joel just saying, yeah. I swear. And Ellie just saying, okay. Personally, that ending didn't hit as hard as in the game. In the game, obviously, it's one of those things where I prefer the original performance, but on top of that, the music at the end was much louder and more pronounced in the game. Whereas in the show, they really like turned the volume down on the music. I feel like they should have turned it up. This is the final moment. You know, you need that music to hit, and it doesn't quite hit as hard. So I, unfortunately, in the final moments of the show, I was left feeling like, the game did it better. But the show still did a really good job. And, you know, that's pretty much covering the story of the show, which was just the story of The Last of Us, with a few kind of changes here and there. But, you know, overall, I'll say that I was quite impressed. I wasn't expecting a whole lot from this show. I've already expressed how I felt about even the concept of this show going into it. But the fact that they were able to get me to watch the whole thing is impressive, because I was not being like, I'm going to watch the whole show. I was like, I'm going to watch this show up until the point where I'm like, yeah, nah, I'm not doing this. And they held on to me for the whole season. So fair play to the people at HBO. Fair play to the people from Naughty Dog that went to HBO to produce the show. You know, I know that Neil Druckmann worked on it, and I'm sure he's not the only person from Naughty Dog that contributed as well. And shout out to everyone that made the show possible. Like, it's not one of the best shows I've ever watched. I know I've said a lot of praises. There are a lot of, you know, I've also mentioned the fact that a lot of times I'm watching the show, I'm cringing. You know what I mean? It's not a perfect show. But considering what we have set as a precedent for video game adaptations, this is far and away, the best one I have personally ever seen. And when they do season 2, I'm going to be checking it out personally. I did not expect to say that, but I'm going to be checking it out. I think they did a great job. And what I would say is, because someone asked me this in my YouTube stories, they asked me, would you recommend watching the show before playing the game? Absolutely not. If you are interested in playing the game, if you're not interested in playing the game at all, okay, yeah, just watch the show, like whatever. But if you are genuinely interested in playing the game and you're not familiar with the story of The Last of Us, do not watch this show before playing the game. It will dampen your experience with the game. The best way to experience the story of The Last of Us is to play The Last of Us Part 1 and The Last of Us Part 2, as well as like the Left Behind DLC, I guess, and then watch the show. Watch the show after, because it's just not as good as the games. And if you're familiar with the story in depth through the show first, the game is not going to be able to surprise you as much. So I would absolutely not recommend watching this over the game if you want to go through the game first. But if you've played the game like me, you're a huge fan of it, and you are actually interested in some more Last of Us content, the HBO show is genuinely a good shout. So good job to everyone that worked on this one. You kind of killed it.